We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, The Declaration of Sentiments. At the turn of the 19th century, women began to revive the initial wave of feminism that had faded away during the abolitionist movement in the 1850s. The new wave of feminism cried for the right of women to vote and to challenge the cult of domesticity that had dominated society. In Susan Glaspell's play, Trifles, the women, Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters, explore the roles of females while searching for the motive behind the murder of John Wright. Mrs. Hale, with every new piece of evidence, exposes the widespread female oppression. Through Mrs. Hale's persuasive behavior, Susan Glaspell creates the mouthpiece character of Mrs. Hale to demonstrate the progressive feminists of the early 1900s.
Glaspell first exposes Mrs. Hale's strong feminism through the defense of Minnie Foster. In describing the young Mrs. Wright, Hale paints a picture of a vibrant, free woman. Mrs. Hale states, "She used to wear pretty clothes and be lively when she was Minnie Foster, one of the town girls singing in the choir. She gives Minnie Foster an identity of her own, rather than referring to her as merely one of Mr. Wright's possessions." Mrs. Hale's seemingly simple observation of the woman Minnie was before not only persuades Mrs. Peters to think of her as a different woman, but also to question the reason for such a change. The introduction of her past shifts the focus from Minnie Foster's guilt to the culpability of her husband. Glaspell guides the audience to conclude that the switch in Minnie's sunny disposition was truly the tyrannical cloud of Mr. Wright. Although Minnie murdered him only the day before, it was truly he who murdered her long ago.
Mrs. Hale's removal of the incriminating stitching prompts the audience to reflect upon oppressive patriarchal laws. While waiting for the men to inspect the crime scene, the woman inadvertently happened upon a critical piece of evidence, a poorly sewn quilt block. Mrs. Hale proceeds to pull at a knot and rip the sewing. Mrs. Hale is responding to the silent cries of an oppressed woman and restitching her future. Hale's unwavering commitment to eliminate proof of Minnie Foster's angst persuades Mrs. Peters to join the cause rather than uphold the law. The removal of the stitches marks the beginning to the unraveling of men's power over women. Ultimately, Mrs. Hale convinces audiences, as well as a woman of the law, that the true issue is not just with Mr. Wright, but with society's laws as a whole.
Mrs. Hale's compelling observations are the final push for a unification of women. After finding the canary, the two women commiserate, realizing, "We live close together, and we live far apart. We all go through the same things. It's all just a different kind of the same thing." The women of the play have now formed a secret camaraderie between themselves. Mrs. Hale's steadfast beliefs have already begun to persuade the sheriff's wife to empathize with Minnie Foster's plight. At this point, they see the common thread of the suffocating patriarchy that binds them all together. Mrs. Hale makes it obvious that there is no difference between Minnie Foster, Mrs. Peters, herself, and ultimately women as a whole. Each and every one of them fights their own personal battles against the perpetual degradation. In finding the canary, the true motive is unearthed, leaving the women at a crossroads to either turn it in or conceal it forever. Glaspell is begging the question of whether or not justice will ever prevail if they choose now to ignore the need to unify and inspire the tide of change.
Glaspell creates the mouthpiece character of Mrs. Hale to demonstrate the progressive feminists of the early 1900s. Glaspell first writes the play to draw attention to women's issues of the time, inequality. Knowing that she could have a greater influence on women, Glaspell converted the play to a more outspoken short story, one in which women could read without the presence of their male counterparts. As the playwright and author, she knew that if she could convince the Mrs. Peters of the world, the ones who are on the fence, the ones who are afraid of change, to stand up and make a difference, women would gain a political voice. Glaspell's work did inspire change with the passing of the 19th Amendment only 2 years after the publishing. Unfortunately, this amendment and the acts of the suffragists did not cleanse humanity of societal ills that continued to face women.
In 1980, Sally Heckel resurrected Glaspell's work to highlight that although the war on women's right to vote has been won, there is still much to fight for. It would be nice to think of this piece as an antiquated snapshot of female oppression. However, 100 years later, society continues to be plagued by this social disease. Why is it that today women are paid 79 cents to every dollar made by their male coworkers? Why is it today men who dominate the government structure try to make decisions on behalf of women? Why is it today that the youth buys into a perpetuated rape culture where instead of teaching boys not to rape, girls are taught not to get raped? Why is it today that women continue to be divided?